your lunch while you're listening to us. But we do have a very, very interactive hour and 15 minutes planned for you all. This is a topic that Jean and I, my co-presenter, who I will introduce in just a moment, are very passionate about and believe very strongly is super important to the success of any mentoring program. And so we're going to be asking you to participate quite a bit today, and hopefully using, as Veronica and Dantel mentioned, the raise hand feature, the chat box to communicate with us. So please, please freely enter any thoughts, questions you have throughout the webinar, and we will get to them as soon as we can. We'll be pausing throughout the presentation to talk with you a little bit. But now I would like to take a moment to introduce my co-presenter, Jean Lahaj-Cohen. It's my pleasure to introduce Jean. She is a close partner of mine here at Mentor National. She's the executive director of Mentor New York. And Jean has been involved with non-for-profit organizations for 30 years. She's been with Mentor New York for 21 years, and motivating and directing volunteers and mentors is really one of her areas of expertise. She has trained over 14,000 volunteers in mentoring, so we are really excited to have her partnering with us here at Mentor National to deliver this webinar today. And her work has really focused a lot on developing school-based mentoring programs, finding compatible business and government partners to produce online resource materials and newsletters. Mentor New York assists nearly 600 different mentoring programs, and they serve over 60,000 young people. And I want to mention on a more personal note that Jean has mentored the same young woman for nearly 10 years. So welcome, Jean, and thank you so much for lending all of your expertise to us today.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Veronica and Dantel, and of course, Delia. I feel like we're partners in crime here. So if you can move to the next slide, please.
Okay. I think I have the controls, but I am not able to move the slides forward, so wondering if my friends at JFS can help me out.
So I'm going to talk a little.
You have to click on the slide and then hit forward or back.
Oh, I'm doing that, but it's not working.
You should actually see arrows, and it'll tell you what number slide you're on, and you should be able to control it by the arrows. They might be on the left side of your screen or on the top of your screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So we're going to talk about what we're going to cover today, and this is a really good example of how you train adults, because one of the things about training adults is we need to have the 4 T's. We're going to tell them what we're going to teach them, and then we're going to teach them it, and then we're going to tell them again, and then we're going to talk about how we did it. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you what our objectives are today. We're going to talk about why mentor training is really so important. We're going to talk about the things that mentors really need to know before they begin, and then some resources for you. At Mentor and Mentor New York, we really believe that one of the best ways that people learn is by watching skills be modeled, and then practicing them themselves. So we decided to deliver this training in a train-the-trainer style. We're going to take you through some of the activities you can do with mentors during a pre-match training, so you can recreate them, customize them to be based on what your school setting is like or what the students who are being served are like. By having gone through the activities yourself, you'll be able to relate more fully to the participants, and it's going to help you deliver the content more effectively. So I've given you 3 objectives for today, and I'm going to ask you in your chat box if you can tell us, are there other things that you want to make sure we cover today? If you could tell us what those things are. I don't know how to win the lottery, but anything else about mentoring, Delia and I will endeavor to answer for you. So do let us know if there are things you'd like us to cover, okay?
Thanks, Jean. And just a note, if you're using our chat box, make sure that you select all participants when you chat so that we can all see what you're typing in there. So thanks, Jean. We'll give you guys a moment to respond to that question if there's anything else you want us to cover. But in the meantime, I did want to mention that this content that we've developed today has really been designed specifically with a particular program model in mind, and that's called the Success Mentors program. Some of you may be involved in that model, others may just more be involved in school-based mentorings in general, and that's okay. So this webinar is really intended to speak to both folks, but I just wanted to mention that the Success Mentors model is really a school-based model that engages school personnel and other folks that are in the school environment as mentors, with the goal of really building a sense of belonging and helping students and families overcome barriers that are specific to attendance. Now, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, really everything we're going to talk about today, relates to, you know, school-based mentoring in general, programs in general. But we did want to mention that we've designed it with that project in mind, knowing that that's a project that or a program model that a lot of schools around the country have really tried to embrace, with the goal of increasing attendance and a sense of belonging for students. So with that, I'll just check and see if there's anyone else who has offered anything that they'd like to get out of this webinar. And it looks like somebody on the line says that they're curious about resources that we have for out-of-school-based mentoring options as well, so community-based programs. No need to address in this training, but just curious about links and materials. So definitely I can speak to that towards the end as we're talking about resources. We can point you to some things that are specific to community-based out-of-school mentoring options. And if there's a particular setting that you're interested in, feel free to let us know, but I'll touch on that. I would say most of the things that we're going to present on today are definitely relevant to community-based programs too, but they just sort of have a spin towards school-based and some of the specific challenges and context of school-based mentoring programs. So thank you for contributing that additional thing. Jean, anything else to add about out-of-school-based mentoring options?
No, I would say we have over 600 programs in New York City and in New York State, and probably 300 are community-based models and 300 are school-based. There are lots of resources for wherever your mentoring is going to take place, and we'll make sure you get those links and resources.
Great. Right. Okay. So before we jump into the topic of training and pre-match training, we want to point out that, you know, today we're going to really focus in on one of the 6 elements of effective practice for mentoring. Many of you may be familiar with these 6 elements of effective practice. Some of you may be less familiar with them, but we never want to call out a specific one of these without mentioning how important all of them are. They're each so critical to a safe, effective mentoring program. And so if you're wondering what I'm talking about, the elements of effective practice for mentoring is really the National Mentoring Partnership's cornerstone publication. It details research-informed, practitioner-approved standards for creating and sustaining quality youth mentoring programs. The 4th edition of this work was published in September 2015, and that contains really the most up-to-date research, practice, and thinking across our mentoring field. And these standards, as we've been talking about, are really intended to be applicable across any type of youth mentoring program, whether it's in the community or in schools. But it's going to look a lot different in schools than it is in the community, and that's why we want to talk a little more specifically about what training will look like for you all today. But it contains some great information, a program planning and management section, you know, detailed benchmarks on each of these areas. So again, if you're not familiar with it, the easiest way to find it is just to Google it. The elements of effective practice for mentoring, and you'll find it as a free download on Mentor's website. All right.
So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about why pre-match training is really important, and what that means in terms of setting up your mentors and the mentoring match for success. The where, when, and what of mentor training, all the things you want to know. And then we're going to cover the activities of training. And we're actually going to ask you for some of these to participate with us. Even though we're not all in a room together sharing a Coca-Cola, we're going to try to do it virtually so you get a sense of what to expect when you run through these. An icebreaker, thinking about who mentored you, even if you weren't in a formal mentoring program, but who in your life has served that role for you. Getting started, what about confidentiality and safety? cultural competence, and then a wrap-up. So we're going to try to cover all of those different things and use the opportunity to let you participate, see what it's like, see how you'll feel offering these things, and then be able to model them for your mentors. So I just want to remind you, this training is actually focused on adults mentoring youth, but many peer mentoring models are really successful, and they have the added benefit that they're great for the mentors who are the peers. But this training does not focus on that. Some of the things are very similar, but there is a whole set of resources available for peer mentoring models, and we're going to refer to those at the end so you can access them. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you, Jean. So I'm going to move us into why is pre-match training so important, and I imagine that so many of you who are on the call today already know why it's important. So I invite you to now go ahead and chime in and tell us why you think it's important, why you do it if you already do it, or why are you interested in it. It would be really helpful to hear that from you all. But as you do that, I'm going to talk you through just some things that we know based on the research about why this is so, so important. So the goal of a mentor training, and again, we're talking about an initial training, ideally happening before a mentor is even matched up with a mentee, is to get your mentors or your prospective mentors to reflect on, number one, the kind of mentor they want to be based on their own experiences, on the insights of others in the group, and then, what do they want to bring to this experience based on all of that. So it's also going to help them anticipate challenges in advance and then consider the best ways to get their relationship off on the right foot. So some things we know from the research. It definitely appears, based on what we know about the landscape of mentoring programs across the country, that most, but not all mentors that are working with formal mentoring programs are receiving some sort of pre-match training or orientation. So, we wish it was everyone, but not everybody is receiving this. Most programs do provide something. We know that mentors who receive training tend to be more satisfied with their mentoring relationships, and that can really help ensure that, especially if you're going to try to retain mentors from year to year in your school-based program, that you're able to do that. And that's a really important component of any mentoring program and any mentoring relationship. We also know that mentor training has documented impacts on the length of a match relationship, as well as the mentor and the student's perception of the quality of the relationship. So we know that based on research. They've shared that their feelings of closeness, their feelings of support, satisfaction, effectiveness as mentors, all of those are increased, in a way that's related to whether folks have received mentor training. So all of this is really, really important. How we've been able to directly tie mentor trainings to specific outcomes for youth, not yet. There's more research that's needed to be able to do that, but we definitely see how important it is to again, folks' perceptions of their work, their retention, the length of time that they stay in our programs. So super, super important. Another thing that we do in mentor trainings is we provide program staff. So you all, if you're going to be the folks who are working directly with mentors and youth, with another opportunity to learn more about mentors. So maybe you've interviewed, you've recruited these mentors, okay, here are the folks that are going to be volunteering to help my students. But when you sit them down and you have some discussions and you do some interactive activities, you really see a whole other side of them. And so that's why we consider training to be part of our screening process. To help us understand, are these folks really the right fit for my students? And if not, does that mean I don't want to work with them, or does that mean that they might need a little bit of additional help in certain areas? So it really, really informs you in a whole other way about what you should be looking out for when it comes to supporting mentors over time. So I'll just say a few words about where and when a mentor training should take place if you're getting started with a school-based mentoring program like Success Mentors, for example. So we really believe in the importance of giving mentors and mentees as much time as possible to get to know each other in the school year. And there's so much going on in the beginning of the school year, of course, we know that. So again, so impressed that folks have made it to this webinar to learn with us today. So we know how much is going on, and it's really difficult, especially if you're starting a new mentoring program, to recruit your mentors, screen them, train them, and match them all in the month of September, which is often what it seems like we have to do. So that's why we say, if possible, to do a lot of that work, you know, before the end of the prior school year, or even over the summer if possible. If you can recruit and screen your mentors, get them all situated and ready and oriented. That way, in the beginning of September or whenever school starts, you can bring them together and do this mentor training and then promptly match them up with a student so that they have as much time as possible to really get to know each other. The school year goes so quickly, especially with all of the different things that are going on in mentors and mentees' lives, so we want to maximize that time as much as we can. However, I don't want to discourage folks who might be piloting a new program or starting to think about, hey, I want to launch a program this year. We've definitely worked with a lot of programs that have started a mentoring program a little bit later into the fall, maybe even in the winter, and that's okay. You know, it's a pilot program. It might be a shorter term experience as long as you're managing mentor and mentees' expectations about how long they're going to be matched up. I think it's okay to do it as a trial, and then maybe next year you'll be able to have, you know, a more streamlined system for when you do these things. The other thing we want to share about this is the research that we've documented in the Elements of Effective Practice really does say that at least 2 hours of mentor training, pre-match initial mentor training, is tied to better outcomes for mentors, similar to the ones we talked about earlier. Better a sense of connectedness to the program, perception of effectiveness in the program. And so we really want to encourage folks to plan for about that amount of time, and we'll be sharing some activities with you in just a minute that you can think about, you know, how am I going to fill 2 hours? There's plenty that you can do, but there's also a lot you can do after mentors and mentees are matched up to plan for ongoing training. And we actually have a specific resource that I can share with you later for those who are curious about what kinds of things they can do throughout the rest of the school year to help support mentors and mentees after they've, you know, met each other. So we'll be talking just a little bit about that too. But for the next hour or so, we're going to be sharing, you know, what would be the content and what would it look like to do an initial mentor training. And so before I turn it over to Jean again, I just want to briefly share, again, based on the Elements of Effective Practice, what should a training cover? What should this initial 2-hour, ideally, mentor training cover? So a couple things. You really want to give your mentees your mentors the opportunity to consider, why are they doing this? What are their goals going into this? Often mentors don't know what that is. They haven't necessarily thought it through. And when they share their goals and their motivation for becoming a mentor, that gives you an opportunity to manage their expectations, right? So if a mentor is coming in and saying, I want my student, whoever I matched up with, to come to school every single day this year, or I think I can really solve, you know, major issues that they're dealing with in their lives, you know, it's a good time to share with them how complicated students and families' lives are, and that mentors are not expected to solve every problem, and that they're really there as a support. Even if folks don't say it in that way, often we sort of get the indication that they might think that they can do more than they can often. And so this is a good first opportunity to start managing expectations and together in a group in a way that can really set folks off on the right foot. It's also a great opportunity. I know a lot of folks on this call are interested in working with teachers as mentors or other school support staff as mentors, folks who are already working with kids every single day. And we know, you know, those folks know a lot about how to work with young people already, so we don't need to preach to the choir. But what they often may not have heard about quite as much are specific relationship building strategies. So they may have an intuitive sense of what works with kids, but what we find sometimes in mentor trainings, even in schools, is that, you know, words like developmental relationships are not words that many school staff have heard before. We'll talk a little bit about that later, what that means, but thinking through, you know, what does it take to build an effective and a meaningful relationship that centers young people? You know, school staff as mentors and other folks volunteering as mentors, they may never have had an intentional opportunity to really think about those strategies. So this provides that opportunity as well. And then we're thinking about some of the specific challenges that youth might be facing and what are their needs, what are the things that mentors should be thinking about helping with, and what are some of the things that they should know are not really, you know, part of their role, and when do they know when it's time to ask for additional help or set a boundary. Those things are really important as well. Talking about working with parents and guardians is always a really interesting topic with school-based mentoring programs, because often what we find is that parents and guardians aren't very involved in the school-based mentoring program. We hear from schools that, you know, sometimes parents will sign a permission slip saying it's okay for my student or my child to participate in this program, but beyond that, they're not really looped in. They're not, you know, asked how they feel the match is going. And so being able to talk with them about how they, you know, mentors can engage with parents and guardians. What should they do to build relationships with families as well, because they're such an important source of information about students and what they need is going to be really, really helpful too. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, a little bit later about just issues around confidentiality, how mentors are, you know, often, you know, disclosed to about really important safety issues or ethical issues that are going on in students' lives, and they can be very complicated. So how do we guide them on you know, what they should be thinking about when those types of things happen. And then you'll also notice cultural competency on this list. And based on, you know, what the element says, cultural competency training is really recommended as part of training related to ethical mentoring. So it's been positively associated with mentor satisfaction, with mentor retention. And this is really important because a lot of our mentor-mentee pairs are going to be, you know, matching up students and mentors from different races, ethnicities, religions, cultures, so many other aspects of identities that aren't going to match up. So when we're not helping mentors bridge those gaps and understand difference, then we may be setting them up for some difficult situations or for a lack of understanding about what their mentees' real experiences are. So that can really, this type of training can really raise the awareness of mentors about how they might be similar to, how they might be different from mentees, and then prepare them to build those relationships in a more sensitive or effective way. And really to build something that we call ethno-cultural empathy, which is empathy towards folks who are in different racial or ethnic groups than you, which may be harder for some than for others, but it's an important thing to directly address and try to build some skills around. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jean to get us started with some of the activities that you can do with mentors in your own mentor training. And again, we're going to be modeling these for you to participate in so you can recreate and adapt them in your own training.
So thank you, Delia. So I just want to reiterate that this process that we're going to go through today is part of what you want to do when you set your training. When I first started training teachers on staff who had volunteered to become success mentors, I realized that it was very important for me to be a credible teacher. And one of the things I wanted to say in the very beginning of my training with them was that I wasn't there to teach them about youth development because I knew they were all good teachers and educators and they know about youth development. But what they might not know about would be the role of a mentor, what the guidelines would be for a mentoring program, and help them to understand what's expected of them and what's not expected of them. So setting a framework for them to be operating as a mentor. And I usually say that at the beginning so that there's no misunderstanding that I really appreciate what they do in their day-to-day work. I'm impressed with how they work with young people, and this is just another step forward for them to do. And I'm only there to train them because it's something outside their regular job. So one of the things we thought about was a good icebreaker. If you work with young people, you probably have tens, hundreds of possible icebreakers you could do. But since we don't have you in the same room with us, we tried to think of one that would actually work virtually. So I have a list of 40 cards that have wonderful quotes on them, all different quotes. And we just picked 10 of them, and you see them on your screen. So I'd like you to take a minute and look at these quotes. I'd like you to think about which one speaks to you, which one says something that you value. And it doesn't have to be the meaning of life for you, but something that catches your eye today and says, wow, that's good. I'd like you to put it into your chat box or Q&A box, your name, which quote, you can just list the number and why that speaks to you today. So take a minute to take a look at all these different quotes. They're from a wide variety of people: Mark Twain, Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Edison, Ralph Nader, Buddha, you know, all the guys that hang out together. and think about which quote speaks to you today. So just give us your name, the number of the quote, and why today does that one mean something to you. So I'll give you a minute to look, and I'll stop talking. Doesn't mean I'm not paying attention, but I want you to be able to read.
Thanks, Jean. And just as a note for folks who are going to chime in the chat box, again, pick all participants so we can all see what you're writing in there. And know that this webinar is going to be recorded and posted on the NSAESC website, so we will only be using your first name just so that we are not, you know, verbally saying anyone's first and last name on the webinar. But if you don't want us to say your first name, please feel free to note that as well, and we can make it an anonymous quote. So we're getting some great suggestions in here. Yeah. Maybe we'll give a few more minutes. Jean, would you like me to start reading out folks' responses as others are chiming in?
But you can keep typing. You can keep typing too if you're in the process of deciding. Go ahead and keep typing if you want to. Go ahead, Delia.
Okay. So our first participant here, I'm going to just use her first name, Molly, says that quote 8 speaks to her because it's important to think about how often we're trying to be the candle and when it's more effective to be the mirror. So the quote is, there are two ways of spreading light, to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it, by Edith Wharton. And she's using the example of, you know, for a particular to, you know, issues of racial privilege or, you know, moments where white folks are often dominating conversations about racial issues, being able to stop talking and really amplify the light or provide an opportunity for leaders of color to share their own voices is one example that she's sharing. And then we have another example from Midge. It's all about how people make you feel. That one spoke to her as well as Anna, who says it's a great fit for mentoring and liking the idea that it's about relationships. So that one is, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel, and that's certainly true of mentoring relationships, or the goal that we have as mentors. Then we've got from Vi, number 9, when a leader's best work is done, the people say, we did it ourselves, by Lao Tzu. And to her, this speaks about leadership and empowerment, and it's important in uplifting youth voice in our program. It's a great point. From Angela, similarly to others, number 4 seems very fitting for mentors and gives people a sense of worth, that they are important, especially when working with young people. It's really great. That one was from April. So really, really great comments here, and thank you all for thinking through this with us.
So thank you for doing this, and I think at this point you can see how you can add your own perspective on any one of the quotes about what speaks to you. I particularly like number 4, people will forget what you said. I have an example of my mother-in-law and my husband's aunt. My husband's aunt is now 101, and they were talking about when another woman in the family made them feel small, and they quoted her, and it turns out it was from 83 years ago, and they both remembered the story, and sometimes they don't remember my name, but they remembered the story from 83 years ago about how badly that woman in the family made them feel. And it's a perfect example of how, when we're in relationship, when we're working with other people, how thoughtful we want to be, how careful we want to be, and how honest we want to be in terms of what we want to be able to accomplish. So having these conversations with your potential mentors is a great way to start to give them the sense of what you want them to be thinking about and working on without preaching at them, because they're going to remember why I chose this quote. It spoke to me. There was something about it that said something to me that was emotional, and I will remember it. So it's a great example to do. There are obviously many other kinds of icebreakers that will achieve some of the same goals, and if you're in the same place, you can try some other ones. I'll open it up here. If anyone wants to give an example of an icebreaker that they've used in a training like this, by all means let us know, and we can share it with the group. And if not, we're going to move along to the next slide.
Thanks, Jean. Yeah, I love that one because to me, I think it builds a sense of agency too for mentors who kind of like are developing their own mentoring mantra. It's a really nice way to get people thinking about what do I want to accomplish or what do I want to stand for in this experience. So once you have, and we'll feel free again to chime in and we'll read your responses even if we get them a little bit later. We want to hear from you guys. So once you've broken the ice, we want to start training participant or grounding the training in participants' own experience with mentors in their life. This is usually a really important place for people to start this learning process. So this is going to help them draw upon what they already know about mentoring from their own life experience, whether they had a mentor or they didn't have a mentor. Often if people say, you know, I didn't have a mentor growing up, I don't have a point of reference here, the question then becomes, what do you wish you had, or what do you think would have made things easier for you growing up? So no matter where folks are coming from, this is an important next piece of the conversation. So let's model this with you all. We want to ask you to think about somebody who mentored you growing up. And it could be, you know, a short-term experience, someone who was in your life for a very short time but really left an impact on you, such as a teacher or a coach. Or maybe you had a long-term mentoring experience with a family friend, an older peer, a teacher, a coach, any adult in your life that you kept in touch with over time. So type into the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. That's also an option. Who is this person to you, and how did you meet them? And we'll give you a moment to chime in. And as you can see, there are some notes here on the slide if folks need some jogging of their memory.
And can I just add, we don't want you to list your parents. And I'll talk about why later, but we'd like you to list someone other than your mother and father, okay?
And just a reminder to select all participants when you put in your comments. And as you're chiming in with who those people were, how you met them, now is also a good time to chime in what were some of the qualities that made them a good mentor? So what was it that made them someone that you remember even now? So feel free to add that into your response as well.
That's great.
Yeah. So we're getting a couple of responses in, one from Anna who says she had a music teacher who was very kind, very caring, honest, funny, and made her feel special. I have to say that is the same person that comes to mind for me every time I do this experience or this activity. I had a creative writing teacher in high school who very much made me feel like the only person in the room, or that I had something really unique to contribute, and that feeling has stayed with me for years. I'm seeing a couple other responses coming in saying that there's a coach who helps really focus on goal setting, which is a great example as well, more of a short-term experience. Any others? Please feel free to jump in, chime in. We're seeing one that was a family friend who looked out for me. Someone else, my first supervisor, a reliable person, good listener, resourceful, always present when I needed his ear, and always follows up with me when he says he will. It's a great example. And that was from Adrian. And then we've got from Vi, a college student organization advisor. He was a role model and an advocate. He encouraged me to keep developing leadership qualities, offered time and guidance, and was also relatable, a relatable young adult when I was a student, so someone you could see yourself in. So all of these are absolutely great examples, and you can see just how common some of these experiences are and the qualities that folks are sharing. Here's another one from Smita. She was a neighbor, an older lady with one child, no grandchildren. She played all the roles and was generous, kind, fun, and made me feel loved. Another person, Angela, sharing one of my mother's friends, encouraging, supportive, someone I felt I could ask for advice. So yes, I mean, it's really interesting that the places that these folks have taken in our minds and our memories and our hearts for so long, people you remember really being there when you needed them, lending an ear, showing you that they cared in so many different ways. So thank you for those examples. And I love to use this activity because people are just so full of wisdom when it comes to their own experience, being able to think about the qualities that are important in a mentor. You know, they are a well of wisdom, and we don't need to tell them how important all of these qualities are. And that often the training really flows from here. You know, people want to talk about this because they often see themselves. Sometimes these folks are the people that have made your mentors want to be mentors. So it's really easy for them to start being able to see what this experience is going to look like for them. So stop there. I wonder if you want to add anything, Jean.
Yes, I just wanted to say, when I first started doing this training, I did it for the Bar Association in Nassau County, and one of the judges said to me, just make a list of all the good qualities of a mentor and hand it out. And I said, no, I'm going to do it my way. And I'm going to do it my way because of quote number 4 that several of you mentioned from Maya Angelou, because people will forget what you tell them or forget what you show them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And making people think about who mentored them, the people who were typing this saying she was generous, kind, and fun, encouraging, supportive, you get a warm feeling in your heart when you're thinking about those people. When they leave the training, they're going to remember that emotional connection to the kind of mentor they had, and it will help them when they're struggling with what kind of a mentor am I going to be, what am I going to be in this situation. They're going to remember the emotional part that you help them surface by talking about it. So it's better than a list of all the things that you can just tick off a box. You're touching the reason they came forward, why they want to be a mentor, and how their mentors made them feel. So that's why this exercise is such a good way to get at the essence of what a good mentor is. Thanks, Celia.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, I mean, this next piece really flows well from that conversation. It's all about what is a mentor and what is a mentor not. And I know for a lot of you who are on the line right now, especially if you're already doing mentoring programs and you might have already done a mentor training, this looks really, really basic. And it is in some ways. But I would say that especially if you're working with mentors who are already playing some sort of role in the school environment, so if you're working with teachers who are volunteering as mentors, school staff, administrators, this is going to be a really important place to pause and reflect and spend some time, because the question may not be what is a mentor, but how is a mentor different, how is being a mentor different from the role that I already play in a student's lives? And I would say this is where we get a lot of questions during school-based mentoring programs that, you know, as they unfold from teachers, school staff, other folks who are volunteering as mentors who are really saying, you know, I have this role in this student's life, but I'm also their mentor. You know, how is that different? How should I be thinking about myself as a mentor differently than maybe how I was, you know, already? And often, you know, for school staff who are volunteering as mentors, they are already playing the role of an informal mentor in many ways, but bringing a little bit more intentionality to their work on a daily basis can really help. So I think this is an important conversation to have. And so we'll model this just briefly now. We won't spend a lot of time here, but just want to ask folks, you know, we're offering this very basic definition of a mentor right here: an advisor, a friend, someone who establishes a trusting relationship, accepts youth for who they are, models healthy behaviors, encourages youth through challenges, and inspires youth to identify strengths and pursue passions. Just to ground your mentors in having kind of a mission statement as a mentor. But are there other things that you would want to add to this definition? Are there other ways that you've described, you know, mentoring to your mentors so that they can really wrap their head around how this role is going to be different from roles they've played in the past? Feel free to chime in now and just offer any other insight that you can, and be sure to share it with all participants so we can see what your responses are. And the other really important part of this conversation, and Jean, I know you probably have some examples of this, is that it's a really important time to talk about boundary setting and being aware that there are other caring adults and resources that young people have in their lives, folks who might be serving roles that a mentor cannot, and that there's not, you know, an unlimited number of roles that a mentor plays in a student's life. They really have to think critically about what's going to be most helpful to a young person long term, and which roles are really not appropriate for them to be playing. And this sounds, again, so basic, but we find that this is really where we get the most questions, the most challenges, is often mentors who might feel some pressure or feel some kind of internal urgency to play a role that really isn't the right one for them. So that's just an important piece of the conversation too.
So just let me say, the reason I asked you not to let your mentors choose a parent as their example of a mentor, not that great parents don't serve a role as mentors, of course they do, and role models, but we want them to understand the boundaries that we're asking them to take on in this new role, and we don't want them to try to supplant the parent. There's no quicker way to have a child removed from a mentoring program if the mentor feels it's his or her responsibility to supplement or contradict what the parent's saying. So if a student says, my father says I don't have to go to college because he has a good job and he didn't go to college and we can't afford it, the mentor is not going to get anywhere by saying, wow, your father's kind of stupid, right? So what might be another way to have a conversation about that is to say, wow, that's great that your father has a good job, but this is about you. So let's talk about what's important to you. So you might think, gee, it would be great if he went to college, he'll have many more opportunities, it's a good thing, but you're not the parent. But can you come back and think about what the student wants, always focused on the student, not in straightening out a parent or anything else. And the other thing is not to feel that you have to take on the responsibility of things that are not yours, not to make sure that the student has a warm coat in the wintertime, or if the student comes to school hungry, not your job to solve all those problems, and we want mentors to know that, because that can be pretty daunting. That doesn't mean we want a child to go without a warm coat, if they live in the north at least, in the wintertime, but there are social services in schools that can help them. Or there usually are free and reduced lunch opportunities in schools, and the mentor can help get the social service people in the school to make those things happen, but not to take on the job of going to Sears or picking up breakfast every morning at McDonald's. We don't want mentors to step over the boundaries of what they're capable of doing. And it's important to lay those out, because sometimes you can get stuck in a place that's not appropriate. When my mentee was in 8th grade, I found out she was dating a senior, and my son, who told me the story, wanted me to call her mother and tell her she couldn't go out with him. And I tried to explain to him my role as a mentor and blah, blah, blah. He said, okay, well then I think I'll beat the kid up. And I said, no, that's not a good option either. And actually he and his buddies came up with a way to introduce the senior to another young woman who was more his age. And lo and behold, my mentee was disappointed for a day or so when he broke up with her. But it was probably appropriate for an 18-year-old not to be dating a 13-year-old. But it was important for me not to step over the boundary of what my responsibility was. So getting the mentors to walk through a few examples like that helps put it into reality for them. So again, I'm not just going to give them a list, I'm going to give them an example so they can think it through. What will I say if that happens? And have an example of what to do. All right, should we move on to the next slide?
Absolutely, and I'll just share quickly. Midge had shared to our definition, she had added that a mentor is non-judgmental, a good listener, and often something that we forget, they provide fun in the mentee or the student's life. So thank you, Midge, for noting how important fun is. We often forget about having fun in this relationship being really critical. So Jean, I'll take it to you.
So one of the things that mentors often come to the training or relationship about is they're anxious about getting started. And sometimes the mentees are nervous, but many times the mentors are actually nervous too because they really want to do a good job. They're volunteering to help a student. And they think they might know what will work, but they're not really sure. And if they haven't been working with young people in a while, you know, if I only work in the business world and I don't interact with teenagers, I might not know about this. So at this point in the training, we like to get the mentors to start thinking about how you might start a conversation and start talking to young people. So I'm always reminded, I'm one of many cousins and I have lots of aunts and uncles. And the aunts and uncles that I really gravitated towards were not the ones who said, so how are you doing in school? Are you going to class on time? You know, what are you learning? Those were not the people that I gravitated to at the family get-togethers. But the aunts and uncles who said, so your mom tells me you're trying to write a play. That's so awesome. Tell me about it. Those kinds of conversations, those are the people I wanted to spend time with and share my ideas with. So you might think about that as you're working and starting to build a conversation with a young person. You want to be able to build trust, and we're going to talk about how to do that in a minute, and some strategies that will work. But we want to remember that if you have a new colleague that you meet, you don't sit down and say, come have lunch with me, and I will tell you about my whole life, my childhood, my divorce, and how everything's going. Not on that first day that you have lunch. When we build relationships, it takes time. We build trust. We get comfortable. It's not any different for young people. Now, you might say, well, this is a mentoring relationship. It's not a friendship. That's true, but it's still a relationship. And I'm going to tell you that one of the most powerful indicators of how successful a mentoring relationship is going to be in terms of helping youth can be predicted by the strength of the friendship. It's not about, are we talking about setting goals? Are we hitting all our goals? Do we have productive conversations about politics and the world events? It's really the strength of the friendship. So your goal and your mentor's goals in getting started should be around, how do I build a friendship with a young person? So some of the things we're going to talk about, and I think you want to emphasize with your mentors, is one, what things have worked with you before so that they can build on the strengths they're comfortable with, and ask them what's worked with you when you're talking to young people. It's good for you to have some ideas to start from if they can't think of anything, but turn it over to them and say, what have you done when you're meeting a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 17-year-old? And get some ideas about how to get started. Another thing to talk to them about is remembering that if the strength of the friendship is the thing that's going to predict how well we're going to be, then it doesn't really matter what we talk about. So we can talk about football, music, politics, any passion or interest that a student has, would be a great thing to talk about. I personally love basketball, but I don't assume that every mentee I have in my life is going to be interested in basketball. And I don't make them talk about it if they're not. That doesn't mean I don't wish I could talk to them about it, but I let it go. So you can talk about anything. Maybe it's fashion, maybe it's nail polish, maybe it's food. It's really whatever you and the student can find to talk about and be connected. And you want to encourage the mentors to go with that. It might not feel like they're making progress towards the ultimate goal of improving attendance, but if they're building a friendship, the student is glad to see the mentor, glad to spend time with them, he or she is going to feel connected into the school building, maybe for the first time. They're going to be glad to see somebody and know that someone is glad to see them. That's going to be a change for a student who's chronically absent and may think that nobody cares if they're in school or not. So building a strategy around things that work, what can we talk about, things the student's interested in, and maybe the student will be interested in things that the mentor doesn't know anything about, but the mentor can say, I don't know anything about that. Tell me about it. I didn't know that 50 cents was not a typo on my mentee's sweatshirt when I first saw her wearing it. So I asked her about it, and she told me all about the musician. And she laughed, of course, that I didn't know what she was talking about. But we spent the whole session talking about music and things she liked. And it really made her comfortable having a conversation with me. The other thing you want to think about as you do this is the importance of building trust as you go forward. So I'll give you an example from my own life, and my son has given me permission to tell the story. When he was 12, he had a major illness, and we went to all different kinds of specialists and doctors, and ultimately he had surgery, and then they gave us follow-up guidelines. And when I was all done with that, my husband and I decided to call his pediatrician and say, Jacob, what do you think? Do you think this follow-up procedure is the right thing to do for our son? And he said, well, didn't the specialist tell you? And we said, yes, but we're asking you. And you might think that's sort of a silly thing, but to me, it made sense because, well, can you imagine why it made sense to us? We trusted him. He knew my son. He had been working with my son for over 10 years. And by the way, my son is all grown up now and has a child of his own, so he's perfectly healthy. But the point is, we trusted his pediatrician because of the relationship we had. He wasn't the smartest guy on the case. I mean, not that he wasn't smart, but he wasn't an expert. But we still wanted to know what he thought because we trusted him. That's the role that the mentor gets to play. He or she might not be an expert in basketball or algebra or French, but if they've built a trusting relationship, what the mentor says is going to be more helpful and provide more strength there. Now, when we start to talk about goal setting, many mentoring programs, the goals are more general. In Success Mentors, we're often focusing on increased attendance. But to achieve that goal, it's more than just talking about attendance. And it's probably not the first way you want to work on this. You really want to set meaningful goals that are relevant to the student. And you want to set goals so the student can practice achieving goals. And practice having an opportunity to say, I didn't think I could do that, but I did. And you really want to give them an opportunity to do that. So sometimes, even at Success Mentors, where we work on attendance, we set other goals so that the student can get some help and some sense that I can do this. Don't forget, last week you didn't think you were going to be able to finish that math assignment, and you did it. You worked really hard. I think you can do this next thing. A strong friendship like you're developing with your mentee, mentors are developing with their mentees, lets them have that opportunity to practice achieving the goals. The other thing that it lets the mentor do is to focus on, we're not fixing what's wrong with the student. We're emphasizing and amplifying what's strong, what qualities they have that are positive, that will allow them to achieve goals and build a strong friendship, feeling like they belong in school. And one of the ways you might practice with mentors is to actually give them a role play. So I'm going to, and you can actually ask volunteers to help you do this. Have one person be a mentor and one person be the mentee. I'm going to ask Delia to be a mentee, but you can all chime in and give me a grade. So I'm going to be Delia's mentor and say, hi, Delia, it looks like you're half an hour late for your first class. You know they're going to count that as an absence, right? You have got to get up earlier. So go ahead, if you want to type in your chat box what grade you would give me as a mentor for Delia. What do you think? A D, okay. I would say that's pretty generous. Thank you, D. So it's not really what we want to achieve, right? But what if I said to Delia, Delia, it's great to see you. Did you see that movie you were talking about? I'm so glad you're here today. I'm really glad you could make it, even if it was hard for you. I wanted to show you that new comic book that I've got that I thought you would like it. Can we maybe have our lunch together later on? So what grade would I get for that one? Oh, I've got an A. It's so good. That's so good. But think about it. I still said, I know you weren't here on time, but you're here now. I'm glad you got here. I'm glad to see you. And I want to spend more time talking to you. If I spend more time talking to you, maybe I can find out why she couldn't get to school on time. What kept, maybe I can help her with it. The first example I gave you, there's no way she's going to talk to me about it, I don't think, to be able to let me help her. So building the friendship, building the trust, focusing on what's strong, not what's wrong, and having that relationship helps the mentor be able to move to the next step. I'll tell you one more example. I'm telling you all my private stories here. My congregation is a very welcoming congregation. But for a while, my parents were real ill, and I live in New York, and I was going to Florida every 3 weeks to deal with all the different things wrong with them. And so I didn't go to church for a year, maybe once. And finally, my mother passed away. I moved my father up here. And anyways, all of a sudden, I could go to church again. And the day I went to go to church, I have to tell you, I was nervous and embarrassed. Now, I had a really good reason why I hadn't been going to church regularly, but I felt like people would judge me. I was embarrassed to be there after not being there for so long. Now, I'm 30 years old, okay? And if I can feel like that when I think I had a really good reason and don't have to answer to anybody, imagine how a student who's been out for a few days, doesn't necessarily have a good reason, is going to feel going back to school. So being the kind of mentor that I was the second time with Delia is really important to be able to make a difference in making them feel welcoming and going forward. So I want to turn it over to Delia to make sure we have time to talk about the next couple of slides because they are important.
Thank you so much, Jean. And before we do that, can I just quickly ask you, when you do these types of mentor trainings and get to this part where you're talking about getting started and all these different elements to it, building trust, all that, how do you generally facilitate this discussion where you're sitting in a group, kind of in a circle, and people are kind of offering different thoughts, or how do you generally lead this kind of discussion?
So actually, one of the things we do is I have somebody be a 14-year-old, and I'm a bad mentor, then a good mentor. And they laugh about it, but they think to themselves, I've done it before. But then I usually ask them to sit around in a circle, and one of the first things we talk about is what kinds of things could you talk to a student about? And we make a list, and the things that are teenage-friendly or middle school-friendly things, we put on one side, and then the higher level thinking we put on the other side, and we try to talk about, focus on the ones that are going to build the relationship, build the trust, and work towards getting to the higher level thinking strategies you want to talk about, so you don't start off with that and scare students off. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, that's great. Okay. Okay, great. So yeah, we wanted to spend a couple minutes before we wrap up talking about cultural competence, or cultural competency. And so we mentioned this is a really critical skill for mentors, but what do we really mean by this? I think it's a term that a lot of people use, but often it's something that we don't fully understand or delve into. And what is most important to mentors in this area? So at Mentor, when we talk about cultural competence, we often draw from the work of Tori Winston-Sturden. She wrote a book called Critical Mentoring. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. Tori's framework, critical mentoring, is really grounded in critical race theory, and it explores how to help both mentors and mentees build a critical consciousness, which is really an awareness of and the ability to critique the cultural norms, values, and institutions that really maintain and produce these social inequities that shape their lives, their communities, and their experiences. So it's a really important framework, and it has implications for training, match support, all types of different things. It covers concepts such as intersectionality of youth identity, the fact that youth have such complex identities that they're bringing to us every day, and that how we can acknowledge all of those different identities. We talked about youth voice. So again, just highly recommend that for anyone interested in this topic. But I want to talk a little bit more about cultural competence. And what we mean by this is really understanding, a starting place being understanding one's own implicit biases. They're both part of the development of critical consciousness. So we define cultural competence in this way as the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact effectively with people of different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, or belief systems than one's own. And that comes from some research done by Cross, Bazron, Dennis, and Isaacs in 1989. But another term we often use is cultural humility, because this implies an understanding that we all have to continue to work on this awareness of cultures and skills involved in cultural interaction. Competence sometimes implies that there's sort of an endpoint that can be achieved. So often we'll use that word humility as well. And so the development of cultural competence begins with an understanding of your own racial identity, your own innate biases, and how this has shaped your worldview. So when we talk with mentors about cultural competence, we want mentors to enter their mentoring relationships by first defining their own identities, their own biases, their own perspectives. And really we want to teach them how to avoid making assumptions about other individuals based on generalizations or past experiences. And we want them to see each new mentee as a person who has a specific constellation of unique characteristics. So one way that we can do this, and we don't have time to really do this activity on the call today, but I just wanted to introduce it to you. It comes from a curriculum that Mentor has developed called the Essentials, a curriculum for people who mentor Black and Latino men and boys, but it's really relevant to lots of other, to really any mentor working with someone who's different from them or not. We're all different from each other, so it's just a really important way for folks to critically reflect on their own identities. And so it really lists out all of these different aspects of identity that you can see on the left: racial identity, sex, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, disability, religion, age, and then others. And it asks mentors to reflect, okay, how do I identify in this area? And then what's the social status for this identity? So how is this identity privileged or sometimes even marginalized in society? And so how does that affect my experience? What examples do I have? And then what are some of the things that I've taken away or things that have affected my experience about this aspect of my identity? And I think this is a really rare opportunity for mentors to pause and reflect on their own experience, which really shapes the way they interact with and build relationships with others. And so having that designated opportunity for them to step back and think about this is just one way to start entering into this conversation about cultural competency, critical consciousness. And again, there's so much more to say about that, but we'll share some additional resources in just a minute that you can use to delve in a little bit more deeply. So now I'll turn it over quickly to Jean to just talk briefly about confidentiality and safety.
So one of the things that we want mentors to do is to make sure that they establish ground rules based on the rules of your program for sensitive conversations. And establishing the ground rules means that the mentor brings up the topic pretty quickly in their relationship, maybe not the first time, but soon thereafter. and the mentor lets the student know, I'm going to keep confidential what you tell me unless you tell me something that makes me think you're in danger of hurting someone or being hurt. And that's how it goes, okay? And that's all they have to say. Now, obviously, you don't say that to a second grader, but middle school students and high school students, you lay those ground rules out. And then if a student asks the mentor to, can I tell you something and promise not to tell, the mentor has to immediately shift back to what the ground rule is. The ground rule is, I want to hear what you want to tell me. If it's important to you, of course. But the ground rules are that I'm the one that decides if I need to get more help or not, based on whether or not you're at risk of being hurt or hurting someone else. So do you still want to tell me about what you're concerned about? So there's no expectation on the student's part that you might not get help for them. You laid that out in the ground rule, you laid it out in the conversation again. No mentor should ever say, oh, sure, you can tell me, I won't tell anybody. That's the wrong answer. Now, you have to know, and you have to have the mentors know how to report unsafe situations. Is it to come to the person who's running the mentoring program? Is it to go to the school nurse? What is the procedure in your school? You should make sure that whoever the mentor is knows what the procedures are. But the rule for working with the student is to be totally upfront. I want to hear what you want to tell me, but I have to be the one to determine if we're going to get help or not. I worked with mentoring programs and mentoring relationships that work with over 100,000 kids in my time, and I do not know of one mentoring relationship that has ended when the mentor says to the student, I want to hear what you have to tell me, but I have to be the one to decide if we get more help. And the reason relationships don't end is because the student is talking to the mentor because they do want help. So you have to remind the mentors that this is not a breach of trust. In fact, it's being a really good role model. If I say I'm going to get help if you need it, then I have to live up to that, even if it's difficult, and get you help. It's exactly the right kind of role model you want your mentors to be, doing something that might be difficult or might be challenging because it's the right thing to do and because I gave my word. So you want to give the mentors that language and know that that's what you expect them to do, be that good role model. And then finally, the last thing I want to say about wrapping up. A good way to wrap up for the day is to have some closing exercise. Again, this is one we have to do virtually, where you might want to hear from them. What's one thing you learned about mentoring today? What's one question you still have? And here's one way to do it. You throw a ball from participant to participant and ask each person who grabs the ball to say one thing they learned and one thing they would like to know more about. But there are lots of other closing exercises you can use. That's just a really simple one to try. You want to also make sure you wrap up by telling them what to expect next. When are they going to hear who their mentee is? How are they going to meet their mentee? Will you introduce them with someone else? How can they both give you feedback about whether they're comfortable with this match? Do they have to have contact with the family? Is there going to be a kickoff program? And so on and so forth. They'll want to know those things. You want to make sure that's the last thing you talk about as they wrap up for the session. So we are close to the end of time, but if you can give us just a couple more minutes, I understand that we're going over a little bit, but I'll give you a chance to type in your questions, and we'll put up the slides that show references and additional resources. So if you could move to those slides, and people can feel free to type in their questions while they're looking at those. These will be posted. These slides will be posted on that website. Even though it's a temporary website, it's got lots of good information. You'll be able to find the resources there and click on them. And in the meantime, if you have further questions, go ahead and type them now. We're going to stay here for a few more minutes and make sure that you have, and there's one examples of resources and additional resources. There are lots of webinars around this, and a critical step of for your program is developing and implementing a match support plan. So you'll want to check in with your mentors in different ways, hear how they're doing. There are different ways you can, and one of the things we're going to do next week on the 12th is hold another webinar that will actually give you sample ways to provide additional information. Are there any questions? Has anybody typed any in that I haven't seen?
I'm not seeing any yet, but I did want to make sure to acknowledge the question that we got earlier about, oh, there is one more question, about community-based mentoring resources. I would say, I'm just going to navigate back to these additional resources. All of the resources that we have listed here are very, very applicable to community-based programs as well. And in particular, this webinar on strategies for creating ongoing mentoring training is very applicable to community-based organizations. And of course, the elements of effective practice is we've got an evidence review on pre-match training, some great resource guides here on peer mentoring for those who are interested, a training toolkit that was created by a program called Youth Build, that's a community-based program. So I would say all of these resources are really, really applicable to community-based programs for the person who asked that question earlier. And Jean, we do have one question that says, if a group of mentors is meeting for support and advice on how do I handle such a situation, is that breaking confidentiality if no names are given?
Oh, so if you have a regular time when mentors are meeting, you should, I think that's a great thing to do because one, it builds the mentoring community. Two, it normalizes their experiences so they don't think, oh, I'm the only one who has these problems with my mentee or he's struggling with this. It helps them see that lots of kids have lots of issues and the mentor's doing the best that he or she can do. Sometimes what you tell the mentors is you did the best you could do here. Nobody else could have done a better job with that. That was a great support for that student, and it's a tough situation he's dealing with. I encourage the mentors to not give names and not to give details that would be actionable. So, for example, if a mentor talks about how a parent is an alcoholic, maybe we want to make sure that no one knows a name for that person or something that would be actionable outside of the setting of the mentoring relationship, knowing that the mentor is going to handle anything that's an unsafe issue. But absolutely, mentors meeting for support and advice is a really critical piece. And one of the things we find, the difference between really good mentoring programs and great mentoring programs is how mentors get supported on an ongoing basis. They're much more likely, twice as likely, to stick with a student and really provide long-term support for them. So supporting them like that is a really good thing to do. Did that answer your question, Mitch?
Thanks for that, Jean. Just so folks know, I know it's difficult, you can't click the links on the webinar right now, but you will receive the slide deck after the webinar, and you'll be able to click all of these links. There's tons and tons of resources, as you can see, that we have between Jean and myself that we can offer you on training toolkits and customizable resources, more activities that you can use. And then we also wanted to offer you the activity that we did about power and privilege and identity. That's from the My Brother's Keeper Alliance webinar series, so you can access that as well, and more activities around that topic. We have a guide to mentoring boys and young men of color where we pulled a lot of that information as well. And then as I shared, we really highly recommend Critical Mentoring, a practical guide for some more on that topic. So again, as Jean said, please join us for this webinar next Wednesday. We'd love to have you on. And I will turn it over to Veronica for a few more updates. Just really want to encourage folks to please feel free to reach out to us for additional resources. We are able to offer no-cost training and coaching on any of the topics you heard about today. So here are some ways to access that. But I'll turn it over to Veronica and Dantel now.
Thanks so much, Celia, and I want to thank you and Jean for sharing all of this great information with us today, and we want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. And we hope you found this information really valuable and informative. A reminder that this webinar and previous webinars are available at our temporary website. Dantel just posted the URL for that website in the chat box. You can go ahead and access that website there. And please keep an eye out for future announcements coming from the National Center. There are a couple more webinars scheduled for this month. We send those announcements out via our network emails, and you can also register for future webinars on that website that we have posted there in the chat function. So I want to, again, thank everybody for your time today, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.